Thank you very much, Surya. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about some work that I did jointly with my colleagues, Wen-Lang Hao and Abby Walters. At first, you might not think that property tax deferral is a logical topic for this conference, but in fact, it will help people manage longevity risk, and it may require a public-private partnership to get it up to scale in any particular state. So next slide. So let me just discuss why we have to be thinking about property tax deferral. And the controlling idea is that many retirees are not going to have enough money in retirement to retain their standard of living. And the reasons for that are the ones we talk about a lot, that people are living longer, medical costs are very high, interest rates are low, Social Security replacement rates are going down, and we shifted from DB to DC. So it means not only are low-income people not going to be able to maintain their standard of living, but neither are people at higher income levels. And the housing issue is a very important part of this not being able to maintain standard of living. If you go to the next slide, you can see the link between the next slide. You can see the link between housing and being not being at risk. So let me just tell you what the slide is. There's a group of gerontologists at UMass Boston that creates something called the Elder Insecurity Index, which is the percent of single people or couples that have inadequate resources to cover basic needs. So this ranks all the states in terms of their insecurity index, and you can see that the ones with the high one are the ones worst off, and 7 of those 10 top worst ones also have very high property taxes. So what this means is that you have rich states like New York and Massachusetts having more households at risk than poorer states like Louisiana or Mississippi or Maine. So policymakers have recognized that property tax is a problem. They have instituted across the country a series of credits or deductions from property tax bills or income tax credits to relieve some of this pressure. But the most promising avenue is property tax deferral. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a map that shows the states that have some type of property tax deferral. And property tax deferral is a very simple concept. You don't pay your property tax now, but when you move or die, you pay back the tax and interest payments. And so the property tax programs that are in effect currently are generally aimed at low-income people, so mainly people with $20,000 or less, and generally the older population, those 65 plus. So it's a very narrowly focused group. The next slide, please. Our interest in this topic has arisen in the context of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts has a circuit breaker program which allows a credit on the income tax for households up to about $60,000 to $90,000. It has a $500 exemption on property tax bills for very low income people. And then it has a property tax deferral program, which you can see there is just minuscule compared to the number of homeowners in Massachusetts. So next slide, please. So we have had a proposal out and about for a new statewide program that could boost participation. And we would allow anyone, or the proposal allows anyone who owns a home to defer taxes on the first $1 million in assessed value. There's a protection from for the state or the locality that the deferrals and accumulated interest plus mortgages cannot exceed 60% of the value. We would try to, the idea was to keep the interest rate on these deferrals very low by having the state administer the program. And then the state would reimburse localities for foregone taxes. And that takes the financial burden off the locality and hopefully would encourage the locality to publicize the availability of this tax deferral program. Next slide, please. So the other dimension of this program is making it simple, because if it's really hard and there are a lot of hurdles, people are not going to do it. So this is an example of a property tax bill, and the idea would be to have a box on that bill that you could simply check and say, yes, I'd like to defer my taxes. Taxes are paid on a quarterly basis in Massachusetts, maybe everywhere. And so when you check for the first quarter, you're checking for that whole year. But that doesn't mean you have to check for the next year or the coming year. You can use it to put on a roof and then pay it back, or you can use it as a source of income year after year. The average property tax in Massachusetts is about $5,000. So this means $5,000 that people would have available for other expenses. Next slide, please. Since we were really interested in having this work, this is just not a theoretical thing. This is something we would like to see instituted. We want to see whether it made sense, or it wouldn't make for a good program if people sort of moved every 3 years. Then you wouldn't really want to borrow against the equity in your home. So we used the HRS and sequence analysis and followed homeowners over the life from age 50 on, and group them in terms of their moving patterns. And basically what this shows is that most people don't move. The never movers are those people who stay in their age 50 house throughout the rest of their lives. Stable movers are people who move at retirement but then stay there. The late movers are people who stay in their age 50 house and then go to rental towards the end of their lives. If you see, it's only really 14% of households that are frequent movers. So that we think that's not a sufficient condition for people to want to use this, but sort of a necessary condition. The next slide, please. So as he said, this is a self-financing program in terms of the individual household. The individual household borrows the money, then the individual household pays it back at the end of the period, whether that's at their death or when they move, plus the interest charge. Unfortunately, when you're trying to institute this at, let's say, the statewide level, it requires some management of cash flows, because at the beginning, you're allowing a lot of people to defer their taxes and you have no repayments coming in. So we did a simple model to see how much debt Massachusetts would have to take on if the state were willing to finance it with the debt. Just go out, issue debt, and cover all the cash flow issues. As you can see, it would increase Massachusetts debt from about 14% to a max of about 15% of the gross state product, and then that amount would come down as the program matured. Next slide, please. So when we did this, we knew very little about, first time, we knew very little about state financial matters, and we're still not expert in that area. So we just thought, well, the state could just go out and borrow whatever needed to finance this program. Well, states don't really issue general obligation bonds for this type of activity. That's usually to finance infrastructure. They do have tax anticipation or revenue anticipation bonds, but those are generally for within-year transactions, although Massachusetts had a 7-year bond in the 90s when it was trying to pay off some deficits in its budget. And we were just in the beginning of conversations with sort of really sharp bond guys in Massachusetts when the world ended. So there, I think if people wanted to do this at the state level, and there were ever monies again available, that it could be probably smart guys could figure out how to do it. Next slide, please. But if it cannot be done, or the state just doesn't want to take on this responsibility, you could look to some sort of public-private partnership, which is really the title of this conference, in which case the state or the state agency, mass housing in Massachusetts would be a logical place to go, could aggregate loans and liens and sell them to a private firm, and then the private financial firm could securitize the loans and sell the securities. It's not as easy as that sounds, but it's a possibility. The downside, of course, is that getting the private sector involved raises the cost of the program. Next slide. But we feel it's very important to try to get it financed one way or the other, because the payoff to this is really big. It is an easy way for people who are hard-pressed to get access to relieve some expenditures so they can spend their money on things that they absolute necessities. And it's a simple process. You don't have to fill out difficult application forms. You don't, unlike reverse mortgages, and I like Chris, I know Chris is there, I like reverse mortgages, but you don't need mandatory counseling. You do need information to ensure that people understand what they're doing, but it's not complicated. The other thing is there are no costs involved. You just would check your property tax bill, and once you did that, then you just simply do not have to pay the tax. The downside compared to a reverse mortgage is you can't get out as much money as you could from a reverse mortgage, but it still would provide considerable relief. Next slide. I conclude. So retirees are going to need money to maintain their standard of living, and tapping their house is a sensible way of doing it. The stable home ownership patterns means that this is really a viable option. Property tax deferral is simple and inexpensive, and we could easily redesign these programs so that you could get substantial participation. In terms of financing, on the household basis, they're cost neutral, but on an aggregate basis, they have cash flow issues, and these cash flow issues either have to be covered by the state or by some public-private partnership.